Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. This is Katina Hansen. I'm with the Policy and Oversight Division in the Office of Grants and Financial Management at NIFA. I am pleased to be here today to provide a presentation on the NIFA policy guide updates that we were able to put into place. I did want to take a few minutes at the beginning to thank a few folks that have provided support through the process. First of all, Bill Hoffman and Faith Peppers, who are helping to co-host this webinar today. Susan Rice, who is our policy branch chief, who has done quite a bit of work on getting this policy guide updated, as well as Laura Gibbons, who is our team lead now for regulations, analysis, and directives in the policy branch, and Fabiola Flemons, who is our financial policy specialist in that team. All of these folks have provided a tremendous amount of work to get us to this point for the policy guide updates. We've also had quite a few folks from all across the agency who have provided input and review. Dr. Chitness and Dr. Castile, who have provided support in getting these updates published, and folks within the department and OMB that cleared the document. So thanks to all of those folks. I'm sure I've missed someone, but it's a lot of work has gone into this. Really starting as the updates to 2 CFR 200 came out in August. And so trying to get us to a point where this policy guide is in line with those updates, as well as incorporating a few other updates that were much needed. All right. It looks like we have about 214 participants right now on the line. I'm guessing that number will grow just a little bit here. But I'm going to go ahead and launch into the presentation. So I will provide some background for the folks that are on the line, an overview of those 2020 updates to 2 CFR 200, which is the regulation for grant making across government, and then a summary of the 2021 revisions to the policy guide and quite a few details on those 2021 updates by section. So I'll walk you through the policy guide. I'm assuming that we have folks on the line that have used the policy guide quite a bit and others that are new to it. So I'll try to provide the update in a way that all can understand. We also will provide the next steps and instructions on how you can provide feedback on the 2022 policy guide. All right, so I'm going to ask that you keep your questions till the end. You're welcome to go ahead and put those in the Q&A box so that when we get to the end of the presentation, we'll be able to handle a few of those questions, I'm guessing, during our time today. And then we'll make sure and we follow up on all the questions that we receive. Okay, so the NIFA Federal Assistance Policy Guide, or what we call the policy guide, describes the statutory and regulatory responsibilities of NIFA federally funded recipients. It's our central source of NIFA's administrative guidance for recipients of NIFA grants and partners and cooperative agreements. We have it available online at nifa.usda.gov/policy-guide. And we also have, of course, statutes, regulations, or other policies that happen in between our revisions of the NIFA policy guide. So obviously the statute and regulation will take precedence over what is in our policy guide. It's to help you, this policy guide, to know what is expected. We also have various policies that will be published generally in NIFA notices, like our NIFA notice on the COVID FAQs that was published, which we'll have another update to coming soon. So in between our policy guide updates, we'll have various types of updates to those policies. We have, back again in August 2020, OMB published the final guidance for grants and agreements in the Federal Register, an update to 2 CFR 200. And we subsequently updated our terms and conditions with the changes that became effective in August, and then many more of those changes became effective in November. We provided in our NIFA update, which comes out weekly to our partners, awareness of those changes to the terms and conditions, and we also publish them on our website. We worked with NSF and NIH and other agencies across government in updating the terms and conditions. And as you know, we've got some of parts of those terms and conditions that are common across the agencies. So we worked hand in hand with them and OMB on getting our updates done to those terms and conditions. The policy guide was finally updated in April 2021. It did have to be routed through the department and OMB for clearance, and it's now published on our website, and it is searchable and numbered as we're required by law for those directives to be. I'll point this out probably later in the presentation again, but that policy guide is now broken into sections on the website so that you can download specific sections and look at them as you need to get to them, or you can still download the entire over 200-page policy guide at one point. Okay, so this is a slide actually taken from OMB, giving you an idea of what some of the major revisions to 2 CFR were. There's an emphasis on stewardship and results-oriented accountability for grant program results. So that is provided throughout 2 CFR 200, also within a couple of the appendices. They standardized terminology to implement standard data elements across government. And so we have data elements that we can choose from to use so that we can understand what each other are speaking, the language that we're speaking, and that you can understand when you're going from grant program to grant program across government, what the differences or the definitions are of those terms. So also there was an effort to make indirect cost rates more transparent, and there was strengthening of the merit review requirements for discretionary grants. They eliminated references to agency non-authoritative guidance, and they clarified the termination provisions. And so really the two in red that they emphasize really, we're working really hard to try to provide results from these grants and be able to demonstrate that not only to the public, but also to Congress and to our partners, and to be able to see what comes out of the grants and the investments that federal government is making. And then also this clarification of the termination provisions, just to know that all of our grants do have the ability for us to terminate those grants if it is necessary. There's a lot of red on this screen. Again, this is taken from some OMB slides. There were updates to align with the FAR and the 2017 and 2018 NDAA to raise micro-purchase thresholds from 3,500 to 10,000, and the simplified acquisition threshold from 100,000 to 250,000. The 2019 NDAA section 889 also has prohibition on certain telecommunications and video surveillance services or equipment, and that was also incorporated into 2 CFR 200.216. There was alignment with GAAP, specifically the general accounting statements, board statement 68 and 45 related to pension costs and depreciation. And then they codified a lot of frequently asked questions that have previously been separate on their website. And I'll point out later, they have just in the past couple of weeks added additional frequently asked questions. So I'm assuming at some point in the future, those will be also incorporated into 2 CFR 200. They clarified the responsibilities of the pass-through entity to address only subrecipient audit findings related to their specific sub-award, so not the cross-cutting. And they clarified the documentation requirements for using the de minimis indirect cost rate. So that is a big one, the indirect cost rate. If you have not already heard this, which I think most of you probably have, the de minimis indirect cost rate is now available to everyone if they do not have that negotiated indirect cost rate, so the NICRA. So that process is a little bit different, but it should be easier if you want to adopt that de minimis indirect cost rate. Okay, this is the most complicated slide that I will put up today. And I don't expect you to remember all of this, but we will be providing the slides on our website, and I think it's a good reference slide. This is all of the major changes to 2 CFR 200, arguably, that were put in place all on one page. So you can go through this and you can look at it. We're going to walk through it as it applied within our policy guide, but I wanted to provide this to you so that you would be able to have one place to get the information. All right, also taking from an OMB slide deck, this is in general our federal grants life cycle. And so there's program administration, pre-award management, award management, then post-award management and closeout, and program oversight. And what we've tried to do here is to kind of align those colors as much as we could with what's in our policy guide. So we, each of these circles is a separate, you're able to download this now separately on our website. And we have an introductory section and then the overview and purpose, pre-award, application evaluation, award issuance, post-award federal requirements, and then a section on allowable costs, and then audit requirements, and then our other NIFA assistance programs. We also have 4 appendices. One is public policy requirements, then definitions, and many of these, or most of these, are aligned with what's in 2 CFR 200. And then the capacity program guide and authority references. So I'm going to walk you through the changes throughout the guide. So hopefully you'll bear with me on that. I did want to give you, again, some highlights of what is within these policy guide revisions. So we did update the guide to reflect all major changes to 2 CFR 200 and other citations. We aligned it with our November 2020 terms and conditions and removed references to those previous FAQs. We updated the guide to align with the terminology in 2 CFR. For example, the term CFDA has been changed to assistance listing, and the term obligation has been changed to responsibility or financial obligation. Then we added language clarifying that provisions applicable to grants also apply to cooperative agreements unless we specified otherwise in the policy guide. We provided policy on progress reports and continuations and non-competitive renewals. So that policy was provided through Dr. Chitness last summer, and we incorporated into the policy guide so that it's there for everyone to see. We've added language to ensure that in future policy updates, NIFA is able to change the deadline for RFAs. So we've heard a lot about the 5 p.m. Eastern deadline. That is still our deadline for all of our requests for applications right now. But we have changed the policy guide so we have the flexibility in the future if we make those changes to accommodate the issues that have been brought up. We also, for the late application policy, it's now included fully in the policy guide rather than in a separate notice. So that's been updated. We also updated the capacity matrix that is in the policy guide. So to me, this is a really great tool. So now for each of the capacity programs, there is a one-pager that has statutory authority, the matching requirements, carryover and waivers. It also updated what we updated for section 1444 in the RFA this year, which is that that carryover and performance period. It was just being able to carry over for 1 year to the second year, 20%, and now it just has a performance period of 5 years, carry over throughout that period. And so that was updated in the policy guide as well to memorialize it. We have done a lot of minor stylistic and formatting edits, such as updating addresses and hyperlinks. Honestly, our staff had to basically rebuild the policy guide. The structure has been kept the same because we really want to work with our partners over the next year to talk about if there are changes to that structure that make sense. But we did clean up a lot of the styles and formatting issues. We updated references, including those to 2 CFR 200.1. This was one of the bigger changes, at least from having to make a lot of subsequent changes related to it in 2 CFR 200. The definitions used to be 200.1, 200.2, 200.3 for each term, and they put all of the definitions into 200.1. Well, as you can imagine, that had a lot of impacts on the numbering throughout the rest of 2 CFR 200. So you'll see that as we walk through the policy guide changes, that there's a lot of changes just to numbering and not to really the substance in a lot of different places. And that's especially true in the definitions section. We clarified for multiple extensions or extensions of greater than 12 months. Those extensions must be approved in writing by the ADO, and awardees should prepare and submit a written request to be received no later than 10 days prior to the expiration date of the award to the ADO. We also clarified that final reports are due within 120 days of expiration of the award. This was a bigger change in the 2 CFR 200 updates, and it was from 90 days to 120 days. So we updated that also to submit the SF 425 within that 120 days. After that time, we can approve only on a case-by-case basis, providing those reports after the 120 days. So we'll go over that. We clarified language on indirect cost. Again, this is a bigger change. The indirect cost de minimis rate now can be adopted by a broader group of folks. For reporting subawards, we updated the threshold to $30,000 and referenced both non-federal and federal entities. And we updated the SAM registration requirements to align with what is in 2 CFR 200. And we clarified language and examples related to expiring appropriations. Most of this is related to 2 CFR 200. Some of these are bigger clarifications that we heard from our partners that we needed to make to the policy guide. I will note on the updated SAM registration requirements, many of you may have heard that government is going to a unique entity identifier. And so that is basically so that you no longer have to pay to go through Dun & Bradstreet in order to set up a SAM number. We're not quite there yet. All of government is supposed to migrate over to that by April of 2022. So we will be working to update the guide as we move over to a UEI or unique entity identifier. And we'll have more information as we get closer to making that transition. Okay, so as we go through the sections, each of these circles will identify the section. And again, these sections are available separately for download on our website. We have in the introductory materials section, there's the table of contents, a list of acronyms, the glossary of frequently used terms, and information about using the guide. What's changed there, we updated the table of contents and the glossary. We updated the using the guide section to reflect that the 2021 changes to the guide are related to 2 CFR 200 and associated policies. And the notice of award will now incorporate the policy guide by reference. So we clarified that. Okay, then we move on to section 1, and that's the overview and purpose. In section 1, under the scope, we clarified that the term provisions in the policy guide refers to both grants and cooperative agreements unless otherwise specified. We also, under the roles and responsibilities, added that ensuring proper publication of requests for applications and compliance with statutes, regulations, and policies was within the Office of Grants and Financial Management responsibilities. So that's the office that my division is within in NIFA. And the obligation was updated to responsibility or financial obligation here and throughout the guide. So whenever we get to one of these where it's throughout the guide, I'm not going to put that in every slide, but just wanted to point it out for you. Okay, so in section 2, which is pre-award, under the application information, we updated CFDA to assistance listings. Again, that's one that happens throughout the guide. And then we updated the SAM registration information. So recipients must maintain an active SAM registration with current information, including information on a recipient's immediate and highest level owner and subsidiaries, as well as on all predecessors that have been awarded a federal contract or grant within the last 3 years, if applicable, at all times during which it was an active federal award or an application or plan under consideration by a federal awarding agency. So again, this is to align with the 2 CFR 200 updates. Also in section 2, under submitting an application, we clarified that matching requirements will be stipulated in the RFA. We also added a reference to a government-wide standard that applies to American Samoa, Guam, the Virgin Islands, and the Northern Mariana Islands. And so that is that NIFA will waive any requirement for local matching funds under $200,000, including in-kind contributions. And that is a stipulation that applies to all grants across government under this 48 USC. So it's really related to any kind of match or cost share. For instance, I used to work for a program at FSA where we did emergency conservation. And so we would also waive this under $200,000. So this is something that applies across. We just wanted to make sure that it's in the policy guide so that when we get into these situations that our staff and our partners understand that this is something that's available. Again, we updated the late submission policy to reference section 2C17 of the guide rather than this separate late submission policy notice that is out there. And then in section 2D, public access to application information, we added some language. And that was when an application results in an award, it becomes a part of NIFA transaction records, which are available to the public. Information that the Secretary of Agriculture determines to be confidential, privileged, or proprietary in nature will be held in confidence to the extent permitted by law. You can read the rest of this. I don't want to read all of it to you, but this section was added in consultation with our general counsel. It's just some general provisions related to public access to application information that we thought should be put in to make our grantees aware of that situation. Okay, so then section 3, application evaluation. We had a number of numbering updates that occurred within the application evaluation section. And then in section 4, award issuance, we also had some numbering updates. We had a change in wording that came in 2 CFR 200.208. Says the federal administrative requirements allow agencies to adjust. I think it was something like make minor changes or something like that. It basically just made it a little bit more flexible, that language. And then there were a number of other numbering changes. This is the section under section 4D, period of performance. One of the places where we updated related to section 1444 funds and the carryover provisions. We also updated on when discussing the obligation period that the 90 days was updated to 120 days. Okay, so that liquidation must occur within 120 days of the period of performance ending. Okay, also in section 4 is where the very valuable, I think, capacity matrix is. So that's on pages 66 through 76 of the guide. It's in section 4G of the guide. So I highly recommend if you work with the capacity programs that you go in, print this off, easy one pager on each of the capacity programs. All right, then in section 5, and I will warn you, section 5 is the longest with the most changes. So I'm giving you fair warning ahead of time as we go into this. In section 5, we have a lot of number changes. We have some clarification that you must be in compliance with the US Constitution and federal law. Again, clarification, you must comply with the US Constitution. We had a little bit of a language change related to those internal controls and other information being designated as confidential. So I'd suggest that you take a look at that section. And then under the cost share or matching, and again, section 5 is post-award federal requirements. We updated under the cost share and matching. The cost sharing or matching means the portion of project costs not paid by federal funds or contributions. And then quite a few additional numbering changes within this section. And also in section H4M, another numbering change. Okay, so under the general procurement standards, so there were quite a few changes related to procurement within the 2 CFR 200 updates. Under section 5L1, we had added competition requirements will be met with documented procurement actions using strategic sourcing, shared services, and other similar procurement arrangements. There was also a change to the language in 5L2 that is, once it is determined that procurement is necessary to carry out the purpose of the federal award, all procurement transactions for the acquisition of property or services required under a federal award must be conducted in a manner providing full and open competition consistent with the standards of the uniform guidance. So again, we will have this PowerPoint available on our website, and the changes in text are in green so that when you go back to this, you can look at it in more detailed way, ask us questions. I'll provide the information at the end, but policyguide@usda.gov is where we will take questions and suggestions for the future policy guide and questions about the current policy guide, as well as those questions that we received today within this presentation. Okay, and then also down in 5L2, we have some reference to the acquisition of property or services required under a federal award. And then we have as addition of a statement of non-competitive procurements can only be awarded in accordance with 2 CFR 200.320C. So again, there's a lot of numbering requirements. If you were one of those people that memorize 2 CFR 200 and all of those sections, then you've got some rememorizing to do on the numbers. All right. Under the methods of procurement, we added generally the micro purchase threshold for procurement activities administered under federal awards is not to exceed the amount set by the FAR. Unless a higher threshold is requested by the non-federal entity and approved by the cognizant agency for indirect costs. This is to align with 2 CFR 200 as well. And under section 5L5, which is domestic preferences for procurements, we added the language about preference for products, goods, products, or materials produced in the United States. And the requirement this must be included in all subawards. Under section 5 again, we're still going through section 5. Under the financial reporting, we did update to the 120 days. So the SF 425 is due within 120 days of the end of performance. And we added, if the non-federal entity fails to complete the requirements, the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity will proceed to close out the federal award with the information available. So this was an update to 2 CFR 200. We're still working on exactly what our procedures will be when we have an entity that does not complete those requirements. but we do have a responsibility as an agency to close those out and not leave them open. So it is important, it's imperative that if you are not able to close within those 120 days, that you contact one of our grant specialists. And so that brings me to the contact information updates, which are also on this slide. And those are for competitive grants, awards at USDA.gov, and for capacity grants, capacity grant questions at USDA.gov. On the section on final SF 425, there were some minor updates, including the 120 days. There was also an update to the name of the report manual, from report manual to report financial report manual. And also an update to the contact information under the program performance reporting. Used to have a phone number that was outdated, so now it just refers to the email, which is electronic@usda.gov. Okay, so under annual progress report. So according to the updated 2 CFR 200.329, annual reports must be due no later than 90 calendar days after the reporting period. Alternatively, the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity may require annual reports before the anniversary dates of multiple year federal awards. So we also updated failure to submit an annual progress report within 120 calendar days of the award's anniversary date may result in grant funds being withheld. For NIFA grants awarded under RFAs that allow continuations or non-competitive renewals, annual progress reports will be due no later than March 1st and may be submitted up to 90 days prior. This is a policy that we put in place last year, and folks were notified via email, but is now within our policy guide, memorialized there. And there's an example of a different situation. So if your grant was awarded in January 1, 2021, and that first progress report is then required on March 1st, 2021. But if your grant is awarded June 1, 2021, you've already passed March 1 of that year. So your first progress report will be required March 1 of 2022. We also added a note for existing awards where the terms and conditions specify a different submission schedule for the annual progress report. Those reports will still need to be provided according to the terms and conditions. However, the recipient may optionally submit an additional progress report earlier in the year via email to the MPL to allow for processing of continuation or non-competitive renewals. There was also a change just to the reference to the section called problems/changes in the annual progress report. All right, so for the final progress report, the final progress report from the recipient is required now within 120 calendar days after the expiration or termination of the award, that end of year performance period. But for subrecipients, they must submit to the pass-through entity no later than 90 calendar days after the period of performance end date. All final performance reports as required by the terms and conditions of the federal award. And failure to submit an acceptable final progress report within the 120 calendar days for the award recipient may result in funds being withheld. Okay, for capacity grant performance reporting, we did change a section, some of the language under VJ2B, and that's capacity grant recipients must submit a report project initiation and receive NIFA approval prior to expending capacity funds on a specific project. Once a project is approved, a project report is required annually, as well as a final progress report at the project's conclusion. Hatch and Hatch Multi-State, Evans Allen, McIntyre Stennis, and Animal Health Grants must submit a financial report annually, which is due each February 1st, which is different than the SF 425. And we will continue on this reporting section to work with Lynn and others within the agency that are working on updating our reporting system so that we can try to stay in track with that. And if we need to publish policy between now and the next policy guide, that will come out in the way of a NIFA notice to help us to align with any changes that are coming through our partner suggestions in that process of updating the system. Then again, there were some updates of the 120 days, quite a few throughout this section. And then a few minor changes. There was a change to 5J4, which is subaward and executive compensation reporting. And this is to align again with 2 CFR updates that were related to the Data Act and requirements of FFATA, the Federal Funding and Accountability Transparency Act. Also updated here is where the update to $30,000 for the limit of reporting all actions is updated here. And so grantees must report all actions that obligate $30,000 or more in federal funds, and the instructions are in this section. Okay, again, some updates to numbering, changes from obligations to responsibilities. And here we get to requirements for pass-through entities, some information related to indirect costs in section 5K3C. In relation to indirect costs, if no approved rate exists, the pass-through entity must determine the appropriate rate in collaboration with the subrecipient, which is either the negotiated indirect cost rate between the pass-through entity and the subrecipient, which can be based on a prior negotiated rate between a different pass-through entity and the same subrecipient. If basing the rate on a previously negotiated rate, the pass-through entity is not required to collect information justifying this rate, but may elect to do so. Or the de minimis indirect cost rate. The pass-through entity must not require use of a de minimis indirect cost rate if the subrecipient has a federally approved rate. Subrecipients can elect to use the cost allocation method to account for indirect costs in accordance with 2 CFR 200.405D. Okay, and then also under requirements for pass-through entity, the pass-through entity is responsible for resolving audit findings specifically related to the subaward and not responsible for resolving cross-cutting findings. So this is where that change in 2 CFR 200 is reflected within our policy guide. So you're welcome to read more on that. And we also updated the numbering here and some more numbering updates. I will try to move Bill Hoffman out of the way so I can see this full slide here. And when grantees fail to materially comply with the terms and conditions of the award, NIFA may take certain enforcement actions in accordance with 2 CFR 200.339-343. So this was part of making our ability to be able to cancel an award a little bit easier under 2 CFR 200, I think, or at least a little more clear. And so that information is now included within our policy guide. Of course, right now we are working with all of you, all of our partners, with the conditions related to coronavirus and all of the other issues going on. We are working with you on a case-by-case basis. We want you to contact us if you're having any troubles, meeting your grant requirements. We want to talk about what your options are early and often. So if you want to talk to the MPL, if you feel more comfortable about that, that's fine. We do encourage you to use that awards@usda.gov website, email, or the capacity questions at usda.gov email address to speak with one of our grant specialists. And so I just wanted to emphasize that here. That's not in the policy guide because it is not, our year-to-year policy, but we definitely are taking these things into consideration. Under 504, again, there was a change to the numbering. Under 506, there was a clarification that suspension of an award is not the same as government-wide suspension pursuant to suspension and debarment regulations. And then we get to close out. So close out, again, updates from the 90 days to 120 days in many sections. If the non-federal entity fails to complete the requirements, the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity will proceed to close out with the information available. So that is within our policy now. And then we added a subrecipient must submit to the pass-through entity the no later than 90 calendar days. Again, that's specified here. And on closeout as well, we added that when a recipient or subrecipient completes all closeout requirements, NIFA will promptly complete all closeout actions for awards. So we have been working really hard on that. I know Calvin Mitchell and Waits Rollerson, their staffs have been doing a tremendous job on closing out a lot of our awards that are out there. And so this really just puts in some of that new policy that's in 2 CFR 200 related to closeouts. Okay, and then again, if you're going to go more than the 120 days, you need to talk to us. That extension may be given on a case-by-case basis in extenuating circumstances. ASAP will automatically suspend access to accounts 121 days after the period of performance ends. So that is why it is really important that you talk to us, communicate. And we made it through section 5. So that's our biggest section. We're now going to move into section 6, which is allowable costs. And factors affecting allowability of costs, we updated to reference the GAAP and specifically Government Accounting Standards Board. We clarified that allowable costs must be incurred during the approved budget period. We also, under prior written approval, we updated and updated the citation, added information related to the transfer of an award. So this is really, if you had a PD transfer, NIFA prior approval must be obtained and is subject to an assessment by NIFA of the risk posed by the new transferee grantee institution. in accordance with 2 CFR 200.206. We also updated the information related to executive level 4 salary ranges. And we added under the direct cost program evaluation costs, and under indirect costs and limitations, we included the indirect cost charged by subawardees as provided in section 1462 of NIREPTA. And then we updated the annual appropriation acts may impose a different indirect cost rate for funds appropriated that year. Therefore, the recovery of indirect costs for agricultural research, education, and extension programs cannot exceed the lesser of either the institution's negotiated indirect cost rate or the equivalent of 30% of the total federal funds awarded. And then again, under indirect cost rates, organizations that do not have a current negotiated, including provisional rate, except for those non-federal entities described in Appendix 7, paragraph D1B, so you can look at that, may elect the de minimis rate. So this is one of those major changes that I spoke about related to 2 CFR 200. Okay, under the allowable, unallowable costs matrix related to pre-award costs, the USDA awarding agency is not required to reimburse costs if for any reason the award is not made, award is less than anticipated, or award is inadequate to cover such costs. If charged to the award, these costs must be charged to the initial budget period of the award unless otherwise specified by NIFA. So that was a clarification there. We also, under the same, in the same matrix, under travel, foreign, international, foreign travel includes any travel outside of North America and or US possessions. Domestic travel includes Canada, Mexico, and US possessions. And then under section 6H1 as well in the matrix, under telecommunications and video surveillance costs, we added the language related to telecommunications and video surveillance that brings us in line with those updates to 2 CFR 200. Okay, and then this is included in some of our RFAs already. We added the language that is related to retirement contributions and the applicability of the 5% retirement cap. So this is the same language that's in the RFAs, just put into the policy guide. All right, now we are on section 7, audit requirements. I know everybody's favorite section. I have the oversight division or oversight branch in my division. We had updates to the numbering, and that was all. Under section 8, under other NIFA assistance programs, we just had updates to the VMLRP webpage link, and then also the VMLRP email address. That's the Veterinary Medicine Loan Repayment Program. And we've made it to the appendices. In the appendices, we had citations that were updated throughout the public policy requirements. The definitions and citations were updated, especially related to 2 CFR 200. There were a few updates to the capacity program guide, minor ones, and then the authority references citations were updated. All right, so I did want to include this slide that has the link to the latest frequently asked questions on 2 CFR. Again, those came out I believe, last week. And so this policy guide, there may be some things that clarify some things even within our policy guide that are in these frequently asked questions. So my staff will be going through those and seeing if we need to provide any additional guidance to you. And then also just to point out that in March, the Appendix 3 of one of the memorandums, M21-20 out of the White House, included updates to the flexibilities. So the flexibilities that we have provided FAQs related to coronavirus, those were added into that appendix. And so we are currently going through those and updating our FAQs. A lot of the dates have been adjusted there. There's some information about salary and other projected costs, canceled events again, the indirect cost rate, single audit extension, and physical inventories. So be on the lookout. In the next few weeks, we anticipate putting our updated guidance related to that out in the way of a NIFA notice. So what's next? NIFA staff and partners can now access the 2021 policy guide by section or download the entire document. We do have some webinars scheduled with some of the regions. If you are interested and haven't heard about it, contacting your regional executive director about a potential follow-up meeting. We really are not going to go through this entire presentation again in those meetings, but we wanted to provide an opportunity for additional questions or comments so that we can talk through some things at those meetings. And we'll gather input from our staff and from partners for future revisions to the policy guide. Our timing on this is that we really want to move to having a policy guide that's updated annually, that comes out right before the fiscal year starts. Because of our clearance processes and because we really want to get your input, we think that our next likely goal for an estimated projected timeline for the FY22 policy guide is January of 2022. We anticipate that we'll have a lot of input that comes out of this policy guide revision. And we want to make sure that we think thoughtfully through that and make sure that we get all of the valuable input along our clearance process before we update the guide. Again, we will be issuing notices if there's something critical that needs to be addressed in the meantime. We also are taking a look at our regulations to see if we need to do any changes there. And if we do enter into that process, we will make sure that we have opportunities definitely for input from the public. Comments and questions. So we're going to move into questions here. I do want to say that if you don't have your questions ready today and you want to go into that, you want to think about it a little bit, you can send those to policyguide@usda.gov. Please add the subject NIFA policy guide comments so we know what it is. If you have questions, you can say NIFA policy guide questions. That'll help us. And then if possible, if you could download the PDF or the section that you want to provide comments to and put a comment box in that PDF, that'll help us so that we know exactly what part of the policy guide that you're talking about when you provide your comments. We're aiming to get all of these comments by May 24th of 2021. And those will be considered for incorporation in the FY22 version of the policy guide. If you don't make that cutoff, your comments are not lost. If we can address it within a notice in the meantime, or we can address it in the FY23 policy guide, we will. So May 24th is a date to put in your heads. And with that, I will move over to the questions. All right, I see we've got some in chat and some in questions. I'm going to start with the Q&A here. Okay, first question is, will we be able to get copies of the slides? And the answer is yes, it will be posted on our website. Thank you, appreciate that. And then will the recording of this presentation be available from the NIFA website? Bill Hoffman is going to work on that. And so we expect that it will be available through our website as well. And then with these changes, will the 1862 institutions and 1890 institutions be treated equally with regard to approvals from NIFA for purchasing equipment, property, and approval for contractors to do needed construction and repairs? So definitely the priority is that we treat our grantees equitably across all institutions and partners. We will, within the laws that are in place, implement those policies in a manner to reach that goal. I understand that some folks had some trouble reading what was on the screen. We again will provide the slides after this, so if you need to zoom in and look at something more closely, that you'll be able to do that. And travel from Puerto Rico to the States is foreign travel. I'll have to look into that one. I probably should know that off the top of my head. Susan might be able to answer it, but I believe that it's considered a U.S. territory, but we will we'll definitely get you an answer back to that one. Do grantees have the option to not allow the de minimis rate to subawardees who do not have a negotiated rate? If you want to contact our indirect cost email address, we do have on our website the indirect cost, and talk about your specific situation. We can discuss it with you. There is some particular guidance really in the regulations related to the subawardees, and it's best if we kind of talk about what your situation is before answering that question. Will attendees be receiving a copy of this PowerPoint? Yes, it will be on our website. And does the policy guide take the place of all other administrative manuals, such as the Evans-Allen Administrative Manual? So we do have some instruction guides and some other things that are still useful, but in general, those administrative manuals have been replaced with this policy guide. Okay, and then in the chat, we have some additional comments here. We will provide copies of the slides. And then the ADO is authorized departmental officer. And then I see that Susan and Fabiola have answered some of these. One of the questions is, It is variable between competitive grant programs whether tuition and other support costs are allowed. Will this update apply to those costs to either make them allowed or not in all programs? As Susan pointed out, the allowability of costs vary program by program according to the authorizing legislation. The webinar will be available on the NIFA website as well. Okay, let's see. I think we have made it through all of our questions. Do any of the other folks on the line from NIFA have anything they'd like to say before we close? Okay. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time, and let us know if you have questions or you have comments. Policyguide@usda.gov. Take care.
Great job, Katina.